I only asked to sit beside my grandson at Thanksgiving. My daughter-in-law's mother grabbed my plate and dumped it in the trash in front of everyone, screaming, "Poor people eat outside." Everyone looked away until my 9-year-old grandson stood up, looked at her, and said one sentence that destroyed the entire family. The smell of turkey and sage has always meant something specific to me. For most of my life, it meant my late wife standing over the stove with a dish towel slung over her shoulder, humming to whatever was on the radio, swatting my hand away when I tried to sneak a piece of the crust off the pie before it had properly cooled. It meant our son underfoot as a boy, sliding across the kitchen floor in his socks, begging to lick the bowl. It meant a house that was loud in all the right ways. I don't have that house anymore. My wife passed 6 years ago, cancer, slow enough that we had time to say everything we needed to say to each other, and still not nearly enough time. My son grew up, went to college on loans and summer work, and every dollar I could scrape together, and eventually married a woman whose family had more money than mine had ever touched in one place at one time. That morning, the morning of the Thanksgiving I'm going to tell you about, I put on my one good jacket. It's a thrift store find, dark wool, a little worn at the cuffs but clean, because I'd pressed it myself the night before at my kitchen table, running the iron over the same fold 3 or 4 times to be sure there wasn't a wrinkle anywhere on it. I told myself it didn't matter what I wore. I told myself that a few times, actually, standing in front of the mirror in my one bedroom, and I didn't believe myself any of those times either. My son picked me up a little after 10. He drove a car his father-in-law had helped him finance, something German and quiet, and he hugged me in my own driveway the way you'd hug a coworker at a holiday party. Quick, warm enough on the surface, over before it really started. "You look good, Dad," he said. "Ready? Ready as I'll ever be," I told him, and he laughed like I'd made a joke, though I hadn't really meant it as one. We didn't talk much on the drive. He had the radio on low, some news station, and I watched the neighborhoods change outside the window, the houses getting bigger and further apart from each other the closer we got to his in-laws' side of town. My son's own house wasn't small either. Nothing like the mansion we were headed to, but nice. The kind of nice that still made me feel like I was visiting a life that belonged to someone else's father, not mine. "My daughter-in-law's mother's already there," he said, about 10 minutes out, like he was warning me about weather. "She flew in yesterday. You know how she can be." "I remember," I said. I did remember. I'd met the woman exactly once before, at the wedding, where she'd spent most of the reception seated as far from my side of the family as the room would physically allow, and where she'd referred to me, within my hearing, as the contractor's father, though I had never in my life been a contractor. I'd been a construction foreman for 31 years. There's a difference, and she knew it, and she said it wrong on purpose, the way certain people mispronounce a name just to remind you it isn't the one that matters to them. We pulled up the long drive to my son's in-laws' house. My daughter-in-law's parents owned it, though her father had passed a few years back, and her mother had simply never left, treating the house the way some people treat a title they refuse to relinquish, even after the job that came with it is over. The place was enormous, columns out front, a lawn manicured into something closer to a golf course than a yard. I sat in the passenger seat for a moment after my son cut the engine, just looking at it. "You okay, Dad?" "I'm fine," I said, just admiring the architecture. He didn't laugh at that one. I don't think he heard it, honestly. He was already checking his phone, the way he'd started doing more and more over the last few years, like there was always some fire somewhere else that needed his attention more urgently than the one he was standing in front of. We walked up together. I could hear voices inside already, laughter, the particular pitch of a room full of people who'd never had to worry about money in a way that changes how a person's voice sounds when they're comfortable. My son knocked once, out of habit I think, more than necessity, and pushed the door open into all of it. The inside of the house was the kind of clean that doesn't happen by accident and doesn't happen without help. Someone else's help. Someone paid to come in and make a room look like nobody actually lived in it. White furniture, glass surfaces, a wreath on every door that looked like it had been ordered from a catalog specifically so that no wreath in the house would clash with any other wreath. I stood in the entryway holding a bottle of wine I'd brought as a peace offering, something decent but not extravagant, and I already knew before anyone said a word that it was the wrong bottle for this house. I wasn't wrong about that. "Well," said a voice from the living room, sharp enough to cut through the general noise of the party, "look who made it after all." I turned. She was seated on the white couch like it was a throne built specifically to her measurements, a glass of champagne in one hand, rings on nearly every finger of the other. She did not stand to greet me. I don't think it occurred to her that she should. "Afternoon," I said. "Happy Thanksgiving." "We weren't sure you'd be up for the drive," she said, though I lived 25 minutes away and had driven considerably further than that plenty of times in my life. "My son said you might not be feeling up to it." "Feeling just fine, thank you," I said, and handed my son the bottle of wine to set down somewhere, since no one had offered to take my coat, or the wine, or anything else. She looked me over the way you'd look over a used car you'd already decided you weren't going to buy. Assessing, slow, done purely for her own satisfaction rather than out of any real curiosity. Her eyes landed on my jacket and stayed there a beat too long. "That's a very nice jacket," she said. "Wherever did you find it?" "A thrift store, actually," she laughed. It was a short sound, bright on the surface, with absolutely nothing warm underneath it. "Of course you did," she said, and then, pitching her voice out toward the room at large, though nobody appeared to actually be listening to her except me, "The help usually eats in the kitchen around here. I'm only teasing, of course." Nobody laughed at that, but nobody objected either. That was the thing I noticed noticed first and understood last how thoroughly this family had trained itself not to react to her. I forced a smile onto my face and said nothing, because I had already decided in the driveway before I'd even gotten out of the car that I could manage a few hours of this for my grandson. A few hours, and then I'd be back home in my own quiet apartment where nobody cared what my jacket cost. My daughter-in-law came out from the kitchen at that point, wiping her hands on a towel, looking flushed and a little harried the way people do when they've been managing a stove for 6 hours straight. She was, in fairness, a genuinely striking woman, and in the very beginning, back when my son first brought her around, I'd been happy for him. I remember thinking she seemed sharp, put together, like someone who'd take care of things. It took me longer than it should have to notice the particular way she took care of things, namely, by managing her mother instead of standing up to her, smoothing things over instead of drawing a line, treating her mother's cruelty the way you'd treat weather. Something to be worked around, not something to be confronted. "Mother, please," my daughter-in-law said now, in a tone that wasn't quite a correction, more like a gentle, practiced nudge, the kind you'd give a child who'd said something slightly embarrassing at a dinner party, rather than something genuinely cruel to a grown man. "Be nice." "I'm always nice," her mother said, sipping her champagne. "It's a free country. I can compliment a jacket if I want to." I looked around the room for the one person who I knew, without question, would be glad to see me. He wasn't there yet. I assumed he was upstairs, or out back, or wherever 9-year-olds go to escape the particular boredom of adults standing around holding drinks and talking about things that don't interest them. My son guided me further into the room, one hand hovering somewhere near my back without quite touching it, the way you'd guide someone you weren't entirely sure wanted to be guided. "Dad, sit wherever," he said. "Dinner's probably another hour." I picked a leather ottoman in the corner, well away from the white couch, because some instinct in me had already decided I didn't want to be responsible for whatever might happen to that upholstery if I sat too close to it. Her eyes tracked me the entire way there, down to my shoes, which were serviceable and clean, and absolutely not the kind of shoes anyone in that room was wearing. "You know," she said, in the way you'd use a word you'd learned specifically because it was mildly distasteful. "My daughter-in-law's father, God rest him, always used to say that if you can't dress for the occasion, you oughtn't come to it. He understood appearances. He built an empire on understanding appearances." "I'm a retired construction foreman, ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level and quiet. "We don't dress up much on a job site. Jeans and good boots mostly. I thought I'd cleaned up all right for a holiday." "Bless your heart," she said, "and I want you to understand that when a certain kind of woman says that phrase to you, it has nothing whatsoever to do with blessing anything. You certainly tried." I looked over at my son, waiting for him to say something, anything at all. He had his phone out again, thumb moving across the screen, and I genuinely don't believe he'd heard a word of the exchange. He'd checked out the second the temperature in the room started rising, and I understood, watching him do it, that this was clearly not a new skill for him. This was a habit, worn smooth from years of practice. The conversation moved on without me, the way it seemed to want to do whenever I was in the room. Talk of a trip to somewhere in Europe the family had taken over the summer. Talk of a new car my daughter-in-law's brother was picking up next month. Talk of the private school my grandson attended. Its tuition mentioned so casually that I did the math in my head anyway, and had to sit with the number for a second before I could push it back down. I sat on my ottoman and let it wash over me, a ghost at my own son's holiday, waiting for the one thing in the house that I actually cared about. Then I heard him. "Grandpa!" He came around the corner from the hallway at a dead run, dress shoes slapping against hardwood, tie already crooked despite what I assumed had been a considerable effort by someone to get it straight in the first place. He hit me full force, arms around my waist, the particular unguarded enthusiasm that only a child who hasn't yet learned to hide how he feels can really produce. For 1 second, one real whole second, none of the rest of it mattered at all. "Hey buddy," I said, and I meant every word of it more than I'd meant anything else I'd said since walking through that door. "How's my favorite guy?" "I've been waiting forever," he said. "Nobody would let me leave my room till you got here." "Did you bring the thing? The wood thing?" I had, in fact, brought the thing. A small wooden puzzle box I'd carved for him over a few evenings that fall. Dovetail joints, a hidden sliding panel, nothing fancy, but something that had taken real time and real care. The kind of gift that costs almost nothing in dollars and rather a lot in hours. I told him it was in my coat pocket and that he'd get it after dinner, and he groaned theatrically, the way only a child fully committed to a bit can groan, and I laughed for the first time since arriving. "My grandson," indoor voice, his grandmother called from the couch, not even glancing over. "And fix your tie, for heaven's sake." He rolled his eyes at me, the particular eye roll of a child who has fully absorbed that a certain adult in his life is simply going to say things like that regardless of context, and went to go fuss with his tie in the hallway mirror. Watching him go, I thought, not for the first time, about how much of my late wife lived on in that boy. The same warm brown eyes. The same way of tilting his head slightly when he was genuinely curious about something, rather than performing curiosity the way some children learn to do for the benefit of watching adults. She never got to meet him. She passed the year before he was born, and I have spent more hours than I'd like to admit wondering what she would have made of him, of this whole family, of the woman on the white couch holding court like she owned the room by divine right rather than by marriage into money that had been made by somebody else's father. My son had been a different kind of boy once, softer in some ways. I remembered him at maybe 6 or 7, standing between between me and a neighbor who'd said something unkind about the dent in our old truck. Chest puffed out, absolutely certain he could take on a grown man twice his size if it meant defending his father's honor. I don't know exactly when that boy became the man sitting across the room now, studying his phone, letting an old woman humiliate his own father over a jacket without saying a single word in my defense. I don't know if it happened all at once or in small pieces over years, one swallowed objection at a time, until swallowing objections was simply what he did, the way some habits get worn so deep into a person that they stop feeling like choices at all. I didn't blame my daughter-in-law entirely either, though I'll admit there were moments that Thanksgiving when I came close. She'd grown up in that house, under that woman, and I have to imagine that a person raised inside that particular kind of weather learns early on that the safest place to stand is directly behind whoever's currently doing the shouting. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it easy to watch, but I understood it, even as I sat there feeling smaller with every passing minute. "Come tell me about school," I said to my grandson, once his tie was more or less cooperating. "Your dad said you've got a science project." His whole face lit up, the way a child's face does when an adult asks about the thing he's actually excited about instead of the thing adults usually ask about. He launched into an explanation of a volcano diorama with more technical detail about baking soda reactions than I strictly followed, and I nodded along, delighted, grateful beyond words for the one unclouded hour I was fairly sure I was about to get before dinner properly began. I should have known better than to think an hour like that would last. Dinner was called not long after, announced by my daughter-in-law poking her head into the living room and telling everyone, with the particular brightness of a woman who has spent the entire day making sure nothing goes wrong, that everything was ready and we should all move to the dining room. The dining room lived up to the rest of the house. A long mahogany table, easily big enough for 14, draped in white linen so crisp it looked like it had never once touched a spilled drop of gravy in its entire existence. Gleaming silver at every place setting. A centerpiece of gourds and dried flowers arranged with a precision that suggested someone had been paid specifically to arrange gourds and dried flowers, which, in this house, I wouldn't have put past them. My grandson had apparently claimed a seat for me already. I could see my name written on a little place card in a child's careful handwriting, positioned right beside his own seat near the middle of the table. For one brief, hopeful moment, walking into that room, I let myself believe that was where I'd actually be sitting. "Oh," she offered, appearing at my elbow with a serving dish in each hand. "We've kept the center seats for immediate family this year. You understand? We've got such a full table." I did understand. I understood it better than she probably realized. I was the father of the man whose name was on the mortgage of the house he and my daughter-in-law actually lived in. The man who'd paid for that man's college education dollar by dollar out of a foreman's salary. And I still, somehow, after all these years, did not qualify as immediate family in this particular house on this particular day. I nodded, because there wasn't really anything else productive to do at the moment, and let her guide me to a seat at the very far end of the table, closest to the kitchen door, the seat that would put me at the greatest possible distance from the actual family gathered to celebrate together. It was, I noticed, positioned almost exactly where a hired server might have stood, had this been the kind of house that hired servers for its holiday meals, rather than doing it all in-house with the labor of a daughter and whatever poor relation could be talked into helping. I sat. I told myself again that it was fine, that a few hours would pass regardless of where I was sitting in the room while they passed. My grandson, however, was not having any part of that arrangement. He came marching down the length of that enormous table with his own plate in both hands, deposited it on the place setting directly beside mine, bumping the little place card with his own name off onto the floor in the process, which he didn't seem to notice or care about, and climbed into the chair like the matter was already settled and had never really been up for debate in the first place. My grandson, his grandmother's voice cut across the room, sharp enough that a few of the other relatives actually paused their own conversations to look over. "Come sit by Nana. You don't want to be all the way down there with—" She stopped herself, though not because she'd thought better of finishing the sentence. She stopped because she wanted everyone to hear the pause, to fill in the ending themselves. "I want to sit by Grandpa," my grandson said, entirely unbothered, already reaching for a roll from the basket in front of him. "He tells the best stories. He used to build skyscrapers. He poured concrete for skyscrapers, darling," she said, not even glancing up from the turkey she was beginning to carve into small, exact pieces on her own plate. "There's a difference. He didn't design them. He didn't engineer them. He poured the concrete other men told him to pour." I felt that one land somewhere under my ribs, sharper than the jacket comment, sharper than the thrift store laugh, because it wasn't really about the jacket or the money at all. It was about making sure a 9-year-old boy understood in front of the whole family exactly how little his grandfather's life's work had actually amounted to in her eyes. I'd spent 31 years on job sites. I'd kept men safe on scaffolding 200 feet in the air. I'd read blueprints the way some people read novels, understood in my hands and my back and the calluses on my palms exactly how a building went from an idea on paper to something that could hold 100 stories of human beings safely above the ground. It wasn't glamorous work. It had never once been easy work, but it had been honest, and it had fed my family. And I did not, for one single second, believe it deserved the tone she'd just used used to describe it in front of my grandson. I said none of that out loud. I'd learned, a long time before that Thanksgiving, that certain people have already decided exactly what they're going to see when they look at a man like me, and no amount of explaining myself was ever going to change the picture in their heads. So I stayed quiet and reached for my water glass, and let my grandson's small, warm presence beside me be the only thing in that whole house I let myself pay real attention to. The food, I'll say this much, was genuinely excellent. Turkey done exactly right. A sweet potato casserole with a pecan crust that must have taken real skill to get that precise green beans done with enough char to actually taste like something instead of just being green and warm. I noticed all of this the way you notice things happening at a distance, through glass, because I could barely make myself taste any of it properly. The atmosphere at that end of the table was cold enough that eating felt almost beside the point. Her brother sat near the head of the table, a heavy-set man in his late 30s wearing a watch that probably cost more than my truck, holding forth on some real estate deal he'd apparently just closed. He had the particular manner of a man who has never once in his life had to consider whether a room was interested in what he was saying because it had simply never occurred to him that it might not be. You should see the margins on this one, he was saying to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone in particular, in the way certain men talk at a table rather than to it. Absolutely obscene. I told my guy, I said, find me 3 more like this before Christmas. His mother beamed at him the way she had not, at any point that day, beamed at anyone else, and I understood, watching that particular exchange, a little more about how a person becomes the woman sitting across from me. Somewhere, a long time ago, somebody had beamed at her exactly that way for exactly that kind of talk, and she'd learned early which currency this family actually traded in. You, she said, turning her attention back to me with the particular relish of someone who has simply been waiting for a natural opening to circle back. I'm curious. You must tell us. What is it actually like, being poor? I mean that sincerely. It must be so liberating in its own way. No responsibilities. No one expecting anything of you. The table went a little quiet at that, though not the good kind of quiet. The kind where everyone becomes suddenly deeply interested in their own plate. I wouldn't call it liberating, ma'am, I told her, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. It's a struggle, plenty of days. But I raised my son on that struggle, put him through college on it, dollar by dollar, paid off my own house free and clear before I retired, no help from anybody. You own a house? Her eyebrows shot up in a display of surprise so exaggerated it would have been comic in almost any other context. I confess I assumed you rented some sort of room somewhere. A house? Well, isn't that adorable? I glanced toward my son. He had his fork moving through his mashed potatoes without actually lifting any of it to his mouth, carving little trenches, the particular busy work of a man who badly wants his hands occupied with something other than the conversation happening around him. Son, I said quietly, not quite a plea, but close to one. You've got nothing to add here? He looked up, finally, and for one brief second, I saw something flicker across his face, something closer to the boy who'd once stood between me and an unkind neighbor, chest out, ready to fight a battle far too big for him. Then it passed, the way it always seemed to pass, and he said, Mom, come on, let's just have a nice dinner, in a tone so carefully neutral it managed to defend nobody at all. I'm only making conversation, she said, delighted, sipping her wine. There's no need to be so sensitive about it. My grandson, beside me, had gone very still. I glanced over and saw him watching his own father with an expression I recognized instantly, because I'd worn it myself plenty of times as a boy watching my own father fail to stand up for something that mattered. It's a particular kind of disappointment that doesn't have words yet, at 9 years old, but has all the weight it's ever going to have, fully formed, sitting behind a child's eyes. I reached over and gave his hand a small squeeze under the table, the kind of gesture that doesn't fix anything but at least says I see you, and he squeezed back, and we both went back to pretending to eat. There was a brief lull after the main plates were cleared, and before dessert, the kind of pause where people refill drinks and the conversation loosened slightly, and I used it to lean over and ask my grandson how the volcano project had actually turned out. Grandpa, can you help me? He said instead, tugging at his collar. My tie's too tight, it's choking me. Come here, I said, and turned my chair a little to face him properly. I'd worn a tie for church every Sunday of my working life, and for plenty of job site meetings besides, so loosening a 9-year-old's poorly tied knot was well within my abilities. I worked it gently, giving him a little more room to breathe, and he sighed with the particular theatrical relief of a child freed from a minor injustice. Better? Much better, he said. Thanks, Grandpa. My grandson, stop fidgeting with your collar. You'll wrinkle it, his grandmother called, not even turning her head from whatever conversation she was having with her son. I noticed, and not for the last time that day, that she seemed to have some kind of internal radar tuned specifically to any moment when my grandson and I were having a nice time together. Some instinct that kicked in the second warmth appeared anywhere near me. He's fine, I said, quiet, mostly to myself. I can fix it myself next time, my grandson said to me conspiratorially, once his grandmother's attention had drifted elsewhere again. I just like it better when you do it. I like doing it, I told him, and meant it more than almost anything else I said that whole day. We sat like that for a few minutes, just the two of us in our own small pocket of quiet at the end of that enormous table, while the rest of the family's conversation rolled on without either either of us. I asked him about his teacher, about a friend he mentioned twice in one breath, and then seemed embarrassed about mentioning it all, about whether he still wanted to be an astronaut or whether that particular ambition had been replaced yet by something else, the way childhood ambitions tend to cycle through every 18 months or so. Still astronaut, he confirmed, but maybe also the guy who builds the rockets, like you build things. I built buildings, buddy, not rockets. Same thing, basically, he said, with the absolute confidence of a 9-year-old who has decided a fact is true and is not currently interested in further debate on the matter, and I laughed, real and unguarded, for what felt like the first time all day. It was, looking back, the last easy moment either of us were going to get before everything else happened. I didn't know that yet, sitting there. I just knew that in that stretch of minutes, with his small hand resting on my forearm and his voice rattling on about rockets and astronauts and a friend from school, I felt something close to what that smell of turkey and sage used to mean to me a long time ago in a different kitchen with a different family around the table. Dessert arrived not long after that, carried out on a silver tray by her own hands. Pies, a trifle, something chocolate that he immediately declared loudly to be genuinely the best thing I've had all year, which I suspected was less a comment on the dessert and more a comment on the general trajectory of his year. Coffee was poured, plates were passed, and it was somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary, pleasant clatter that I made the request that changed the rest of the evening. I don't know exactly what made me ask. Maybe it was the coffee working some small courage into me. Maybe it was just that after everything else that day, one small, reasonable request didn't seem like too much to hope for. Would it be all right, I said, pitching my voice to carry just far enough, if I moved down and sat next to my grandson properly? I'd like to hear more about his school, and it's a bit of a stretch shouting down the table. It wasn't an unreasonable thing to ask. I want to be clear about that. There were empty chairs by then, some relatives having already drifted off toward the living room with their coffee. I wasn't asking anyone to move. I wasn't asking to displace a single person from where they were sitting. I was asking to close a gap of maybe 8 feet at a table that, by that point in the evening, had considerably more empty seats than full ones. The room went quiet in a way it hadn't gone quiet all day. Not the pointed, papered-over quiet from earlier, but something with an edge to it. The kind of quiet that happens right before a held breath gets let out. She stood up, not slowly. Her chair screeched hard against the hardwood floor, loud enough that a couple of the relatives in the next room actually turned to look through the doorway. "This is my daughter's house," she said, and every trace of the bright, sweet cruelty she'd been using all day was simply gone, replaced by something flatter and considerably more dangerous. "Poor people do not get to pick their seats at my daughter's table." I opened my mouth to say something. I genuinely don't know what. Some attempt to smooth it over, some retreat back to my assigned chair, but I never got the chance to finish the thought. She reached over, took my plate, the dessert I'd barely touched, the fork still resting against the rim, and carried it in front of every single person still seated at that table, straight into the kitchen. I heard the trash can lid bang open. I heard the wet, ugly sound of a full plate hitting garbage, chocolate and crust, and whatever was left of the meal I'd been given, all of it going into the bin like it was something that needed to be gotten rid of rather than something meant to be eaten. She came back into the dining room and stood over my chair, triumphant, the way you'd stand over something you'd just successfully dealt with. "If you want a seat that badly," she said, loud enough now that there was no possible way anyone in that house could claim not to have heard her, "you can eat outside like the rest of the strays." Nobody moved. That silence deserves some explaining, because it wasn't confusion, and it wasn't shock exactly either. Those relatives had clearly seen this woman operate before, in one form or another, and I don't think a single person at that table was genuinely surprised by what had just happened. It was something closer to a table full of people who had each, individually, made peace with the fact that saying something would cost them more than staying quiet ever would. My son stared at his coffee cup like it held the answer to a question nobody had actually asked him. My daughter-in-law studied her napkin with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing the pattern woven into it. Her brother had gone very interested in his phone. I sat there with my empty hands in my lap, in a beautiful room full of people I'd known, in some cases for years, and every one of them had found somewhere else to look. I opened my mouth again. I still don't know what I was going to say. Maybe nothing. Maybe I was simply going to stand up, walk to the front door, and let my son find his own way to explain to me later why none of this had been worth defending. I didn't get the chance to find out, because that was the exact moment my grandson pushed his chair back. He was a small guy for 9, always had been, and the suit he was wearing had never quite fit him right. The sleeves a little long, the jacket a little wide across shoulders that hadn't caught up to it yet. He stood up straight, squared himself toward his grandmother, and looked right at her, and he did not flinch, not for a second. "Grandma," he said, "you just threw away food, and there are people who don't have any. Why would you do that to someone you love?" Nobody answered him. Not her, not my son, not my daughter-in-law, not her brother. Not one single person seated at that enormous table said a single word. He looked around at each of them in turn, waiting, giving every one of them, one by one, an actual chance to be better than they had all just chosen to be. His grandmother's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, and nothing came out of it. I had watched that woman command a room all day without once appearing to search for a word. Watching her fail to find one now was, I'll admit, one of the more satisfying things I witnessed in that house, though satisfying Satisfaction wasn't really what I was feeling in that moment. Mostly, what I felt was something closer to disbelief, that it had taken a 9-year-old to say the one true thing nobody else at that table had been willing to say all day. She looked briefly toward her own daughter, some old reflex reaching for backup. My daughter-in-law didn't give it to her. She was staring down at her plate like it had personally wronged her, and for the first time all evening, I saw something on her face that looked less like careful management and more like genuine shame. My son opened his mouth. For one long second, I actually believed he was going to say something real. Finally, after an entire day of silence, that whatever had made him defend me from a neighbor's cruelty once, years ago, was still somewhere in him, waiting for exactly this moment to surface again. "Mom," he said, to his mother-in-law, not to me, not to his own son, standing there having just said the truest thing anyone had said all day. "Maybe we should all just, let's not do this at the table." It wasn't nothing. I'll give him that much credit, looking back. It was the closest he'd come all day to actually saying a word in my defense. But it also wasn't the thing his son had needed him to say, and I watched my grandson's face as he heard it, watched something in his 9-year-old expression settle into an understanding I wished with everything in me that he didn't have to carry at that age. Her brother, at least, had the decency to look uncomfortable, setting his phone face down on the tablecloth, though he still didn't say anything either. My grandson didn't wait for any of them to find their words. He climbed down off his chair, walked the full length of that long, beautiful table, past his own seat, past his mother, past his grandmother still standing there with her mouth working uselessly, and came and stood beside my chair instead. He didn't say anything else. He just reached over and took my hand, the same small hand that had rested on my forearm not 20 minutes earlier while he told me about rockets, and held on. I looked down at him, and then back up at the table, at all of them sitting there in that expensive, silent room, and I understood something in that moment that I don't think I'd let myself fully understand until then. That whatever this family was, whatever it had decided it valued and didn't value, my grandson had just shown every single one of them, in one plain sentence, exactly what they'd all failed to be. His grandmother finally found her voice again, though what came out of it was smaller than anything she'd said all day. "He's just a child," she said, almost like she was trying to convince herself of something. "He doesn't understand grown-up things." "I understand you threw away food," my grandson said, still holding my hand, still not letting go. "That's not a grown-up thing. That's just wrong. Everybody knows that's wrong." Nobody at that table had an answer for a child holding his grandfather's hand and telling the truth, and I don't believe, to this day, that anyone in that room ever will. I sat there for a moment longer with his hand in mine, and I thought about my wife, and about the kitchen that used to smell like this on this exact day every year, and about how strange it was that the thing I'd been missing all afternoon, the thing that made a holiday actually feel like one, had been standing right beside me at that table the entire time, waiting for the rest of them to catch up. My grandson squeezed my hand once, hard, and didn't let go.